Florida, on that evening, unfueled itself in bouquets as a winter paradise. Palms, oranges, and beaches were extolled in northern newspapers, as if the sun had held sway, capable of banishing every shadow. Yet, behind these postcard visions, the state was structured by another reality, less amenable to the camera's gaze, far more obdurate, a formidable edifice of laws, regulations, and entrenched customs, marshalled beneath a name that had, in its very utterance, grown almost prosaic, almost bureaucratic, itself Jim Crow. For decades, decrees had amassed within the annals of Florida's legislature. They bore innocuous titles: amendments, provisions, school regulations, canons of electoral governance. Within them, one found lengthy, chilling sentences, devoid of overt wrath, yet delineating a stark line of separation across every facet of daily existence. Public schools for whites, schools for blacks, carriages for whites, carriages for blacks, hospitals, waiting rooms, libraries, at times extending even to the Bibles within courtrooms. Every aspect was labeled, categorized, numbered. Segregation was not merely a cast of mind, it was a formalized system of documentation. On Christmas Eve, 1951, the rural counties of the East Coast pulsated to the rhythm of this invisible architecture. In Mims, in Titusville, in hamlets lost between the pines and citrus groves, the color of one's skin dictated which door one might enter, which counter one approached, which chair one was permitted to occupy. The roads stretched identically for all, yet the destinations differed. A black person might pass by the white school, the courthouse, the sheriff's home. All was visible, almost within reach, and yet strictly forbidden, much like those reserved spaces on trains where empty seats beckoned yet could never be claimed. Local newspapers narrated another Florida. They chronicled Christmas festivities, parades, special sales in shops, midnight masses in white churches adorned with garlands. On inner pages, sometimes, a boxed item might signal an altercation, an incident, or a regrettable tragedy concerning black individuals, without lingering, without plainly naming what transpired. An unprosecuted lynching, a beating by masked men, a body discovered in a ditch. The black press, hundreds of miles away in northern cities or a few southern urban centers, spoke, for its part, of mob violence and terror. Between these two narratives lay a fracture, one asserted, the other attenuated, sometimes to the point of erasure. In the registries of Florida's courthouses, Christmas brought no pause to the ceaseless flow of cases. Matters of debt, land disputes, minor infractions swelled the piles of paper. When the aggrieved party was black and the aggressor white, the pages grew rare, thinner. At times, a prosecutor had deemed the case lacking sufficient foundation. At times, the inquiry had been unfurled. Often, there was nothing at all, save for oral memory, passed from mouth to mouth in places where black people gathered far from prying eyes, porches at dusk, church meetings, back kitchens after closing. For Florida in 1951 was also a geography of silence. In the evenings, when the heat receded and the light withdrew, black communities retreated into their neighborhoods, their churches, their wooden homes, often built by their own hands. Certain roads were avoided once night fell. Unfamiliar cars were noted. In the distance, now and then, the sound of an engine slowing, then accelerating, was heard. Children learned early not to ask certain questions, not to hold certain gazes, to return home swiftly after school. Fear manifested not through screams, but through accumulated small habits, through a constant prudence that became a second skin. In black schools, teachers toiled with meager resources. Buildings were often old, poorly maintained. Textbooks had already served in white schools, marked by the names of children who would never arrive here. Maps of the county hanging on walls displayed borders, rivers, capitals. They revealed nothing of the social fault lines within the state. These were inscribed elsewhere, in payroll slips, which revealed that black teachers earned less than their white counterparts for equivalent work. In school regulations that set differing criteria based on skin color, this inequality was no accident. It was conceived, reproduced, codified, then naturalized by the language of authority. In school board minutes, order, tradition, and the proper functioning of institutions were invoked. They presented themselves as guardians of a fragile balance, threatened by any attempt at genuine equality. Those who challenged this order were depicted as agitators, extremists, sometimes as outside troublemakers, even when born within the county. Official vocabulary manufactured a version of reality where the victim became suspect the moment justice was demanded. Yet, beneath this layer of smooth, white writing, another memory was being forged. In Black Baptist and Methodist churches, congregants gathered to celebrate Christmas. They read the gospel of the birth in a stable, sang hymns of hope and deliverance. The wooden pews were rough, the windows sometimes cracked, but the atmosphere was dense, charged with the voices of those never invited to sit in the vanished benches of grand white churches. Sermons that night spoke of peace and goodwill among men, but between the lines they also whispered of another promise, that of a justice that stemmed neither from courthouses nor county offices. Bodies, too, carried archives that paper did not record, hands made by orange picking, backs stooped by fields, scars left by a blow, a fall, or belated medical care. In some families, a grandfather hanged from a tree was still remembered, an uncle vanished after arrest, a cousin dismissed from their job for speaking too loudly. These recollections did not appear in official registers, but they structured the way one held oneself, spoke, or remained silent. They inhabited simple gestures, the locking of doors, the drawing of curtains, the checking of the clock before venturing out. Nationally, talk evolved around the Cold War, the communist threat, American prosperity. National newspapers, presidential speeches, army recruitment posters painted a confident nation, sure of its power, eager to present itself as the champion of freedom worldwide. This image, too, was etched onto paper, declarations, treaties, propaganda leaflets. But in Jim Crow, Florida, American citizens were denied the right to vote, to learn, to receive medical care like others. Their freedom was measured by small details: a train station bench, a water fountain, an inaccessible ballot box. On Christmas 1951, all this coexisted. The illuminated windows of white shops, the small neighborhood gatherings in black communities, the sermons calling for peace, and, beneath it all, this structure of laws and customs that hierarchized lives. In the wooden houses of rural hamlets, simple meals were prepared, a few decorations hung, modest gifts exchanged. Children's laughter and songs rose into the soft Florida night. But none of those living on the black side of the line could entirely forget what the law thought of them. For at the heart of this Christmas night, beneath the hymns and prayers, lay a muffled unease, that of a system that never truly closed its eyes. Local power did not sleep, even when office lights were extinguished. Files remained stacked, registration forms refused, police reports incomplete, photographs of bruised bodies tucked away in anonymous folders. Violence manifested not solely in the flash of weapons or flames, but in the quiet continuity of these papers that articulated who mattered and who did not. It was in this Florida forged of wood, stone, and ink that, unknowingly, the night that would forever make the name of Moore was being prepared. A night where Christmas carols would mingle with the roar of an explosion, and where the chasm between the America of proclamations and the America of victims would become impossible to ignore, even in the most meticulously drafted documents. Beneath the Mims pines, afternoon light filtered through high branches, dappling the ground with irregular patches like torn pages. The small locality held no grandeur. A few wooden houses on stilts, a dirt road, a modest school, citrus fields stretching to the horizon, and, in the distance, the discreet rumble of trains along the coast. Nothing, at first glance, suggested that history would remember this name. It was precisely this apparent banality that the archives revealed. Tax registers, student rosters, cadastral maps. Mims was a marginal note in Florida's ledger, and the Moores, initially, seemed secondary characters in this administrative landscape. In the school system's files, Harry Tyson Moore's name first appeared as that of just another black teacher. One found his hiring date, his successive assignments, his salaries, invariably lower than those of white teachers with equivalent qualifications. Professional evaluations highlighted his punctuality, his rigor, his ability to maintain order in the classroom. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would make headlines. Merely a man who rose early, prepared his lessons, and sometimes walked several miles to reach the school where children with worn shoes awaited him. Harriette, in those same archives, appeared under the name Harriette Sims Moore. She, too, was a teacher. Reports depicted her as serious, demanding, meticulous about discipline and cleanliness. Students' notebooks, preserved by a few families, displayed neat handwriting, precise corrections, and brief but encouraging remarks. Here again, all seemed ordinary. A woman who managed her classroom, recited multiplication tables, explained grammar rules, and ensured that the black children of Mims learned to read, write, and count better than what was expected of them. The Moore home, as described by the era's period photographs and neighbors' testimonies, was simple, built of wood, set on sandy ground shaded by pines, a porch, a few steps, a door opening onto a modest but orderly interior, a kitchen table where meals were eaten, but also where reading was done, papers sorted, and late-night discussions held. In a corner, shelves held books, school textbooks, Bibles, a few novels, pamphlets sent by the NAACP. On the walls, perhaps one or two family photographs, framed diplomas, teaching certificates. All proofs of a dignity patiently constructed in a world that challenged it. To the 100 neighbors, Hay and Harriette were primarily that. A respectable, serious, hard-working couple. He was remembered walking erect, a lean silhouette, clean shirt, briefcase in hand, always slightly hurried. She was recalled as more composed, observing much, her gaze attentive, her voice firm without being harsh. Neighborhood children knew they could knock on their door for homework, help, to borrow a book, or simply to warm themselves by the sound of adult conversation. The Moore house was not rich in possessions, but it was rich in words, ideas, and attentiveness. In the payroll registers, one also glimpsed the other side of this ordinary existence. The meager salaries, the various deductions, the persistent discrepancies between black and white teachers. For the couple, this meant counting every dollar, organizing life around constant financial constraints. The house was repaired little by little. They saved to buy a few more books, a better lamp for evening reading, a dress or a shirt for special occasions. This frugality was both imposed and chosen. Imposed by the system, chosen by the couple who prioritized dignity, education, and stability. In recollections gathered years later, some former students spoke of the particular atmosphere in the Moore home. At the table in the evenings, talk evolved around school, of course, but also about what transpired beyond Mims. Hay read newspaper articles he received by mail, sometimes from the national black press. Harriette, more quietly, sorted papers, organized, reiterated certain points, questioned her husband about what he intended to do with this or that piece of information. There were no grand, impassioned speeches in those moments, but a slow, shared political awakening. This intellectual complicity did not manifest in official documents. It was intuited in the consistency of their choices. Both could have, by accepting certain compromises, become more discreet, retreated into a strictly domestic and professional life. But the Moore home gradually became a hub. Colleagues, activists, neighbors came to discuss, sign petitions, and hear news from elsewhere. The couple remained careful to maintain a facade of impeccable respectability. No disorder, no alcohol, no visible excesses. In an environment where the slightest misstep could be used against them, the ordinary was also a survival strategy. There was, in this daily life, a weariness that left no trace in the files, but surfaced in testimonies, the fatigue of perpetually having to be exemplary. Exemplary as teachers, exemplary as neighbors, exemplary as spouses, exemplary as prudent activists. The long days at school, collections in the evening, discreet meetings, letters to write. At night, beneath the pines, the house was silent, yet this silence was inhabited. They pondered their daughter's future, the diffuse threats, the obstacles that arose with every attempt at progress. Yet, if one observed this couple solely through the eyes of authority, they remained almost invisible. In county archives, their names appeared on taxpayer lists, on a marriage certificate, on property deeds, nothing more. No particular note signaled danger, no annotation described them as central figures. This was another form of violence. Ease. What the Moores represented to their community had no dedicated column in the state's registries. The black community of Mims, however, saw them differently. In oral histories, the couple was spoken of with respect, sometimes with contained affection. They embodied the possibility of a structured, educated life in a world that pushed towards resignation. They organized meetings, encouraged parents to keep children in school as long as possible, patiently explained the importance of knowing how to sign one's name on a form. Gradually, their home became a fixed point in a shifting landscape, a place where one knew someone would try to respond, explain, and help. On Christmas 1951, Harry and Harriette approached their 25th wedding anniversary. This milestone appeared on invitations, cards, in conversations. 25 years of shared life, under the same roof, beneath the same pines, sharing the same table, the same hopes, the same worries. The few gifts prepared for that evening, the dishes planned, were not luxurious. They bore, above all, symbolic value, to celebrate endurance, constancy, perseverance, to celebrate the ordinary as a victory in itself. Nothing in this existence was designed to become the core of a national narrative. Harry and Harriette had neither a platform, nor a microphone, nor an elective mandate. They had school notebooks, registries, a few meticulously arranged files in a piece of furniture in their home. They had their reputation built on seriousness, calm, and firmness. They had what is sometimes called a small life, which, in the light of what was to follow, appears as an obstinate resistance to a system unwilling to grant them equality. Beneath the Mims pines, the wind rustled the branches, stirred the sand, sometimes carrying the songs from the nearby church to the Moore home. Outside, the world remained hostile, structured by laws that placed them at the bottom of the ladder. Inside, around the table, a man and a woman had chosen to believe that, despite everything, one could live with dignity, teach, love, raise a child, read newspapers, and discuss justice. It was these repeated, almost invisible gestures that would one day make them targets. It is these same gestures that, even today, lend their story the profound gravity of an ordinary life, shattered for daring to desire a little more than the achievements accorded them. In the 1930s and 1940s, Harry Moore's life seemed, from afar, to blend with that of so many other black teachers in the South. He taught, corrected, filled out report cards, signed attendance registries, attended school meetings. But as time passed, These very papers that organized his work began to reveal something else to him: the precise structure of injustice. In the payroll slips, in the staff rosters, in the examination statistics, he saw in black and white what others preferred to consider a mere tradition. The first signs of this shift were discernible in the most mundane acts. By comparing salaries, for instance, a white teacher with the same qualifications and seniority earned more. This was not an impression nor a rumor. It was a column of figures in a register. Similarly, budgets allocated to black schools were lower, expenditures for buildings, materials, libraries less substantial. All this was accounted for, sometimes proudly presented at school board meetings. Inequality was not an accident, it was a budgetary line item. Hay, a rigorous teacher, began to note these disparities, to tally them, to compare them. The numbers spoke to him. They transformed his diffuse anger into structured conviction. What he experienced daily, the worn textbooks, the dilapidated buildings, found precise translation in these documents that the administration considered neutral. Neutrality, however, was an illusion. These tables were the detailed blueprints of a system of subordination. At the same time, the question of voting acquired new importance for him. For a long time, black Floridians knew that the right to vote existed for them only on paper. Poll taxes, literacy tests, complex forms, restricted hours at the registrar's office. Everything was organized to minimize their participation. Hay observed these obstacles with the eye of the teacher he was. The literacy tests, especially, incensed him. Black people were required to read and interpret passages of the Constitution, even as their schools were denied proper funding. It was then that forms began to become a battleground for him. He understood that merely knowing how to read and write was insufficient. One also had to know how to navigate the paper screens erected by those in power. During discreet meetings at home, he explained to neighbors the procedure for vote registration, the errors to avoid, the common pitfalls. He insisted that everyone learn to sign their name clearly, to fill out an address correctly, to keep a copy of every submitted form. Against a system that humiliated by treating black people as children, he wielded mastery of the very forms of administration. Hay's encounter with the NAACP gave this intuition a broader structure. The organization's pamphlets, later found among his papers, described not only injustices but also methods of action: vote registration drives, legal appeals, letters to political officials. Everything, once again, passed through the written word. Petitions, complaints, reports, letters of protest. Another bureaucracy, that of dissent, was taking shape. Hay naturally found his place there. He was not a charismatic orator, he was a man of files. In Mims and neighboring counties, he began collecting names, addresses, dates of registration denials. Each case was a story, but also a line in a ledger. A man was denied registration because he could not cite an article of the Constitution. A woman was sent home because the office was already closed when it was not for others. Another had to return 3 times, each time to be told a different document was missing. Hay noted, classified, archived. He transformed a succession of individual humiliations into evidence of a system. This activity, in the eyes of local authorities, was quickly identified as dangerous. Sheriff's reports, notes sent to white county officials, mentioned his name. He was described as very active among the colored, as someone who encourages complaints. The words used were already an attempt at disqualification, not a citizen claiming rights, but a troublemaker. Yet, what Hay did primarily transpired on paper. He did not lead massive marches. He did not smash windows. He filled out forms, helped others fill them out, sent letters, compiled figures. Consequently, the struggle for equal pay in education took shape. With others, Hay participated in preparing legal appeals against salary disparities between black and white teachers. Here again, Everything began with documents, pay stubs, contracts, official scales. They had to be gathered, compared, to demonstrate that for the same work, the same qualification, the state paid less to black individuals. This approach demanded a particular detachment. One had to view one's own salary as a symptom, expose it, submit it to the scrutiny of lawyers and judges. The intimate became evidence. The moral dimension of this struggle was profound. For Hay, it was not merely about earning a few more dollars a month. It was about demonstrating that the lives and labor of black people were, in principle, worth as much as those of white people. Pay stubs, from this perspective, became exhibits in a large trial, the one he symbolically brought against a state that had elevated racial hierarchy into an accounting rule. By agreeing to fight on this ground, he knew he was exposing himself. A black teacher publicly challenging administrative decisions was a displaced body in a landscape authorities sought to keep static. Nights in Mims subtly changed their texture. The Moore house remained lit late. On the table, one found not only school notebooks but also membership lists, letter drafts, NAACP enrollment forms. Harriette, as always, tidied, organized, read. She pointed out an address error, corrected a misspelled name, suggested a more cautious phrasing. Activism, in the Mooey household, was nothing spectacular. It was patience, an accumulation of well-executed details. Each signature collected for a petition was an act, but also a responsibility. In the eyes of some neighbors, an apprehension emerged. They appreciated what Hay was attempting, but they also knew the possible reaction of local forces. Stories of retaliation circulated. A man beaten for attempting to register to vote. A house burned after a complaint against an influential white person. A teacher dismissed without notice. The Moos were not naive. They heard these tales. They knew that the hardest blows did not always come from the margins, but sometimes from the very heart of institutions. An unrenewed contract, a punitive transfer, a loan refusal. Yet, it was precisely in the awareness of this risk that Hay fully became what could be called an activist. Not because he courted danger, but because he could no longer bear to remain silent. The forms, the ballots, the signatures he handled daily reminded him that if nothing changed, injustice would continue to replicate endlessly, year after year, generation after generation. He had seen enough brilliant children leave school too early, enough discouraged parents give up on going to the polling place, to no longer be content with merely doing his best within the existing framework. In the NAACP archives, his name began to appear more frequently. It was found at the bottom of letters describing the situation in Florida, in activity reports mentioning progress in black vote registration in various counties. He gradually became an essential link between national directives and the harsh reality of small towns. This man who, in the morning, taught children to read, now devoted part of his nights to teaching adults how to read the laws that crushed them. Thus the activist was born, not in the sudden tumult of an explosion, but in the obstinate rustling of paper, in the ink drying on forms that one hoped would one day be recognized, in the late glow of a lamp set upon a wooden table, and already, in county offices, in the whispered conversations of the men who held local power, his name circulated. He was watched, noted, filed. In both camps, the future was written in black ink on pages that would, one day, form the very framework of the story now told. In the archives, Harriette Sims Mooey's name often appeared second, always behind her husband's, as if official history had decided to place her one step back. On school administration records, she was teacher, colored school, with sober assessments, serious, competent, satisfactory discipline. No mention suggested she shared Hay's political choices, that she participated in meetings, that she stored the most sensitive files in a discreet corner of their home. And yet, without her, the trajectory of this couple would have been different. In the classroom where she taught each morning, Harriette was, first and foremost, a figure of stability. Testimonies from her former students, collected much later, converged. She spoke in a clear voice, without raising it, yet no one dared defy her. The wooden desks, the cheap notebooks, the textbooks already marked by use in white schools, all formed a modest setting that her presence imbued with dignity. She insisted on neat handwriting, on punctuation, on reading aloud, to read correctly, to write without error, to sign one's name with assurance 48. These were not merely academic skills, but also inspection reports described her as strict but fair. Frozen phrases were found there, exhausting nothing of her reality, respected by students, good classroom management. Nothing about the moments when, after the lesson, she kept a child a few minutes longer to explain a rule he had not grasped. Nothing about the small notes she sometimes slipped to parents, written on scraps of paper, encouraging them to let their son or daughter continue school instead of sending them to work in the fields too early. Her existence, her own, passed through these minute gestures that left no trace in official files. In the evening, another form of teaching commenced around the Moore family table. Hay bought forms, bulletins, letters. Harriette, having tidied the kitchen, sat with him. She was not merely the observing wife. She was the critical eye, the correcting hand, the mind that weighed words. In some preserved drafts, her influence was discernible. A phrase too direct crossed out, replaced by a more cautious formulation. A legalistic tone, simplified for readers unfamiliar with court language. She ensured that the written word remained accessible to those on whose behalf it was penned. The house, little by little, became a place where the boundary between domestic life and clandestine activity blurred. The chest where important documents were stored held not only birth certificates, diplomas, and property deeds. It also contained membership lists, copies of letters sent to authorities, and notes on cases of voter registration denial. Harriette knew their exact location. She knew which files to place at the bottom, which names not to leave lying on the table, which sheets to burn when they became useless and too compromising. In the few testimonies that spoke of her with precision, a recurring motif emerged, that of silent vigilance. When visitors arrived, she observed from the window before opening. She recognized cars, silhouettes. She knew which conversations could be held aloud and which had to be confined to allusions, agreed upon keywords. In a world where the slightest remark could be reported, distorted, used against them, she practiced a form of protective censorship, not to stifle truth, but to safeguard it from hostile scrutiny. School authorities, for their part, began to perceive that she was not merely a diligent teacher. In some reports, discreet mentions appeared, familiar with civil rights activities, possible influence on the community of color. She was not directly accused, but questions were asked. Rumors circulated. Meetings were held at the Moores. Papers not solely related to school were being filled out. For a black female teacher, this reputation was dangerous. Local power knew how much the school could be a breeding ground for awareness. It tolerated this idea poorly when the teacher was a man. It tolerated it even less when it concerned a woman. Harriette, however, never presented herself as a heroine. She continued to do what was expected of her: maintain her home, teach, participate in church life. In congregation registers, her name appeared among those of women who organized collections, meals, charity, sales. Here again, nothing explicitly indicated that she used these moments to speak of vote registration, to encourage other women to support the endeavors of their husbands, sons, and brothers. The church pews, the annex rooms where coffee was served, became places for the circulation of information, advice, and warnings. Clandestinity, in Harriette's life, had nothing romantic about it. It slipped into the interstices of a routine structured by obligations and constraints, collecting papers, preparing meals, caring for the house, attending religious meetings, maintaining an impeccable appearance in the eyes of those who watched. In this already busy schedule, she nonetheless found moments to copy a list, read a report, hide a sheet. Each gesture was simple, but each carried its share of risk. A poorly closed drawer, an indiscreet visitor. A search could suffice to transform this life into incriminating evidence. Psychologically, this dual existence weighed heavily. Loved ones reported, years late, a fatigue that sometimes showed in her features, in her silences, not the weariness of a repetitive domestic life, but a deep exhaustion, that of constantly having to be on guard, monitoring what was said, to whom, where, at what moment, measuring every word, every invitation, living in a world where trust was never a given. Even in moments of celebration, Christmas, birthdays, family gatherings, this vigilance never completely disappeared. It would slacken slightly, then return, at the slightest unusual sound outside, at the slightest misplaced word. Official documents said nothing of this inattention. They knew Harriette only by her inspection notes, her seniority, her remuneration. They did not record her sleepless nights, her worries for her daughter, her conversations with Hay, where she weighed the risks of this or that action. Before the files, she never appeared as a co-signer, but the reality behind these papers was different. Many of these letters, petitions, and reports were conceived, discussed, sometimes reformulated together. In some Mims families, Harriette was also remembered as the one who, insistently, stressed the importance of education in a context where everything pushed toward abandonment. She knew that the struggle waged by Hay over salaries and voting would only fully bear fruit if the next generation entered the world with sharp intellectual tools. She insisted that girls as much as boys continue school, learn to read documents, to understand what they signed, not to be intimidated by paperwork. From this perspective, her classroom work and her participation in clandestine activities were not separate. They were part of the same horizon. Harriette's perception by the white world, however, remained limited. For many, she was merely Mo's wife, a background figure. This relative invisibility sometimes offered protection. She was underestimated, but it also carried its share of symbolic violence. To be constantly relegated to the role as wife, even as she undertook an essential part of the clandestine work, amounted to dispossessing her of her own story. The official archive, by mentioning her sparingly, prolonged this invisibility. It is only by cross-referencing testimonies, recollections, and the few letters where her name appears that one can begin to restore her true place. As Christmas 1951 approached, Harriette, like many women in the community, prepared the house for the holiday. She thought of the meal, the table, the few decorations that would lend the evening an air of celebration, despite their modest means. At the same time, the files, letters, and lists never left her mind. They were there, in a drawer, on a shelf, in a corner of the buffet. They were as much a part of the landscape as the dishes or the neatly folded laundry. Domestic life and activist life became tightly intertwined, to the point where one no longer always knew where one ended and the other began. Beneath the Mims pines, therefore, it was not merely a man who, though forms, opposed the established power. It was a couple, and at its heart, a woman whose discretion had long veiled her decisive role. Harriette managed the classroom, the home, and the protective shadow beneath which acts of resistance were organized. In a system that strove to reduce black people to strictly defined functions, she silently embodied a complexity that the archives failed to name. When Christmas night came to shatter their home, this clandestine part of her life would become clear, but too late to be heard by those who, nonetheless, had always had it before their eyes. To comprehend what surrounded the Moore home in the 1940s and early 1950s, one must look beyond Mims, toward those spaces where the night belonged to other forces. In Florida's archives, Files relating to the Ku Klux Klan formed fragmented material. Sheriff's reports, FBI notes, newspaper clippings, poorly framed photographs of flaming crosses. Nothing was truly complete. Everything was scattered. But pieced together, these documents outlined a presence, that of an organization that did not merely intimidate in the shadows, but embedded itself within the very structures of local power. In some counties, membership lists seized during investigations revealed professions: merchants, police officers, prison guards, clerks, sometimes even elected officials. Among them were men who, by day, signed forms, issued permits, registered properties, and who, by night, donned hoods. Crosses, burning in fields, by roadsides, or near black homes, were not merely a spectacle of hate. They functioned as a coded message, a warning. Their placement was often strategic, visible to those who needed to understand, discreet for those who preferred to see nothing. Local newspapers treated these manifestations ambiguously. Sometimes they ignored them. Sometimes they mentioned them in a few lines, speaking of alleged Klan members or unidentified groups. The terms used attenuated responsibility, blurred the lines. Emphasis was placed more on disruption of public order than on racial violence. Conversely, the national black press, when able to gather testimonies, used more direct words. 2. Lynching, intimidation. Between these two estimates, a persistent discrepancy. What for some was a problem of disorder, was for others a policy of organized fear. This duality was echoed in police reports. Some sheriffs summarily reported nocturnal incidents without mentioning the KKK inscription left on site or the leaflets found in the morning. Others are clearly described masked, armed men, identified by witnesses. Yet, in the vast majority of cases, no serious prosecution was initiated. Files were opened, a few hearings took place, then the pages closed, classified for lack of sufficient evidence. This insufficiency was not merely legal, it stemmed from a tacit desire not to go too far. The Klan did not only act through fire and blows, it also knew how to wield the tools of civic life. In some local elections, ballot papers mysteriously disappeared. Machines broke down in black neighborhoods. Polling places closed earlier than scheduled. Officially, these were technical problems, administrative errors. Unofficially, they were often maneuvers aimed at reducing the electoral weight of black people and their few white allies. Moore observed this, though the reports he sent, the testimonies he collected after each election. Votes intimidated at the polling place entrance, police officers present to maintain order, who scrutinized some more than others. Rigged ballots wore no hoods, but they obeyed the same logic. Where a burning cross brutally signaled a boundary not to be crossed, electoral manipulation drew a subtle, less visible boundary. It told black people, you may queue, fill out a form, cast your ballot, but ultimately we will decide if your voice counts. This silent violence, inscribed in the official election results, was, perhaps, for Hay, the most unbearable. It precisely distorted the right for which he urged his people to take risks. In this context, the NAACP's organizing efforts were perceived by the Klan as a direct provocation. Voter registration campaigns, meetings explaining rights, letters sent to authorities denouncing irregularities were not merely administrative gestures, they were challenges. Internal FBI and Florida State Service notes showed that some white officials feared Negro agitation likely to destabilize the community. The phrase outside agitators occurred frequently, as if to deny the fact that men like Hay Moore were native sons, rooted in these counties. Klan members, in interviews collected decades later with former members or informants, rarely spoke of Hay Moore as a neighbor. They designated him as a threat, an abstract figure. For them, he embodied that dangerous link between national civil rights organizations and the daily lives of black Floridians. By targeting his work, they believed they were striking at the head of a movement. They, too, in their own way, read reports, monitored recurring names, noted signatures at the bottom of petitions. The climate then prevailing in Florida was thus not one of isolated violence, but of constant tension. In some counties, there were memories of black homes targeted by gunfire in the night, anonymous phone calls, whispered threats after church or at the market. The message was always the same: stay in your place. This place was defined by laws, by customs, by two. It was accepted that black people work, serve, obey. It was refused that they vote, challenge, or consider themselves full citizens. For Hay and Harriette, this atmosphere was not an abstraction. It was felt in glances at the store, in sudden silences upon entering a public place, in seemingly innocent questions posed by white people, curious to know who visited their home. They knew their correspondence might be opened, their movements observed. When burning crosses appeared in the county, even if not planted on their land, the signal was clear. The possibility of becoming a target was not theoretical. In the letters Hay addressed to the NAACP and other organizations, this acute awareness of danger was palpable. He described the situation in Florida with measured, precise, almost clinical words. He spoke of civil rights violations, systematic discrimination, extra-legal too. He did not use the register of personal complaint, but that of a report. This manner of writing was a protection. By adhering to the language of law, he hoped to place himself under the scrutiny of national attention, where the Klan and its allies preferred to act in the shadows. Yet, this strategy had a downside. The more his name circulated in these networks, the more visible he became to those who considered him an enemy. Rigged ballots and burning crosses eventually converged on him. In the minds of some men, the equation was simple. To weaken the movement was to silence those who structured it. The symbolic violence inscribed in the archives, unequal salaries, manipulated votes, discriminatory laws paved the way for a more brutal violence. Thus, as Christmas 1951 approached, the Florida traversed by warm winds and citrus scents was not merely a backdrop. It was a state where the Klan was neither a spectre of the past nor a mere fringe group. It was a force that circulated between fields, streets, offices, courthouses, sometimes even churches. Between the crosses burned in the night and the official figures inscribed on ballots, a continuity existed. It was on this taut, invisible line, in postcards, that Hay and Harriette Moore stood, with their forms, their books, their convictions, amidst the pines that had not yet heard the sound of the bomb that would shatter this fragile balance. December 1951 commenced, in official documents, like any other month. In county registers, the same columns of figures, the same lists of taxpayers, the same routine reports. Weather bulletins indicated a mild winter, with no remarkable inclemency. Local newspapers spoke of Christmas preparations, store sales, school plays. Nothing, on paper, indicated that a threshold was being crossed. And yet, for those living close to the ground, beneath the Mims pines, something had changed in texture. For several months already, Hay Moore had felt increasing pressure. The letters he sent to the national NAACP in New York reflected an intensification of his activity in Florida. Vote registration campaigns, denunciation of violence, comments on local court decisions. In return, he received responses, encouragement, instructions. In the preserved files, December was not distinguished by the volume of mail, but by its tone, more urgent, more grave. One discerned, in watermarks, the awareness that the newfound visibility of his work placed him on the front line. Within the black community, rumors circulated. It was said that men had been seen leaving a meeting, noting names, observing license plates. Talk spread of a car that had stopped. One evening, near the Moore home, headlights extinguished before slowly driving away. These accounts did not appear in official archives. They were transmitted, later, by hesitant voices, seeking to articulate an impression, that of being watched. Nothing was certain, everything plausible. In a climate where the Klan's capabilities were known, vigilance blurred with fear. Some close associates recalled anonymous phone calls. Calls where no one spoke, where one simply breathed on the other end of the line, then hung up. Others evoked disguised voices, insults, veiled threats. Hay was advised to calm down, to think of his family, to remember who made the laws here. These threats were never recorded in an official report. They belonged to that register of informal pressure, difficult to prove, but profoundly effective in instilling dread. In that same December, national black newspapers continued to mention his name. He was cited for his work for equal pay, for his efforts to increase the number of registered black votes in Florida. He became, for a distant readership, a figure of civic courage. This image, flattering and deserved, had a converse. It confirmed to local enemies that he was perceived, elsewhere, as a symbol. And in a system where violence was often exercised as an example, symbols attracted punishment. Local authorities, meanwhile, maintained their silence. No explicit traces of direct decisions against Hay or Harriette Moore at that time were found in the archives of sheriffs or county councils. This silence, however, was not neutral. It must be read in parallel with other attitudes. The absence of a firm reaction to Klan outrages, indifference to complaints filed, the lack of serious prosecutions after acts of intimidation. By allowing things to happen, by saying nothing, the official apparatus contributed to creating a climate where extra-legal violence felt authorized. Throughout this month of December, daily life continued. Hay continued to teach until the Christmas holidays began. Harriette managed her classroom, prepared the house for the holiday, pondered their 25th wedding anniversary. In their home, they discussed menus, guests, the evening they wished to be simple, yet memorable. Christmas was not cancelled because Dunge existed. Dunge, in reality, was a lady pat of the scene. It was integrated as a permanent given, like skin colo or salé amounts. Yet, some signs we too clee to be ignored. Fiends, Moe cautious, O pessimistic, urged Hay to step back a little, to let Othes take ove, at least for a while. They spoke of umos, of conspiracy, of comments, head in bass or white gathings, talk of making an example, of calming those people down. Hay listened. He did not believe himself invulnerable. But he also knew that halting his actions would be interpreted as a victory by those who wished to keep black people in fear. For him, to give up now would be to betray not only his convictions, but also all those he had encouraged to overcome theon fear. This moral dilemma placed him in an almost insoluble tension. On one side, responsibility toward his family, his wife, his daughter. On the other, responsibility toward his community, toward that idea of justice he had helped awaken. Documents did not provide access to his intimate thoughts, but they intuited those testimonies. A man away of the isks, yet unable to turn back. December 1951, for him, was not merely a holiday period. It was a time of assessment, of in-weighing. He knew he was approaching a line that Othes had cost and paid with their lives. In this changed atmosphere, the silences of the authorities acquired an almost deafening dimension. No public statement was made to unambiguously condemn theists, no serious initiative to protect those visibly exposed. Official discourses, when they existed, remained generic. They spoke of public ode, of respect for laws, without naming victims o agessos. This refusal to name was a way of leaving reality in the shadows. What was left unsaid was not, outwardly, a problem. In black churches, by contrast, Wads took on a different tone. Advent Siemens evoked the birth of a child in a hostile wold, the fragile light amidst the darkness. Without directly uttering Hay's name o' the clans, Pastor spoke of the necessity of standing firm, of not succumbing to Teo. They reminded they conjugants that the fist Christmas did not occur in safety, but in precariety. The faithful, who knew the Umos, had these allusions, silently translating them into the own context. Between the wooden pews, gazes met, heavy with understanding. At the Moo home, preparations continued, tidying, hanging papes, those meant to be visible, those to be hidden. Thoughts tuned to guests, to neighbors who might come to share a moment of conviviality. Thoughts tuned to getting cards received, to those yet to be sent. Some bore messages of hope, others expressions of gratitude for help endeavored in various endeavors. Each scrap of paper, each signature, recalled the importance of what they had undertaken. Nothing was entirely private, nothing entirely public. Everything was caught in a web of connections, gazes, judgments. In this early December, nothing spectacular, outwardly, transpired. No grand speeches, no riots, no resounding trials. But the pieces were falling into place. The men who hated what Haymore represented observed, conversed among themselves, perhaps planned. The institutions that should guarantee safety looked elsewhere. The community that admired and followed him prepared to celebrate Christmas, vaguely aware that this joy would, as always, possess a particular fragility. Thus, December 1951 was a month of half-spoken threats, of rumors circulating in the margins, of official silences heavy with consent. It was a month when violence had not yet manifested in an outbreak, but was already working its way into nights, conversations, daily gestures. Hay and Harriette navigated between Christmas shopping and files, between church hymns and anonymous calls, between the legitimate desire to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary and the awareness that, in this state, nothing was ever guaranteed for those who dared to sign their names on the side of civil rights. The night of the 25th approached, like all nights, but that one would carry the brutal collision between these subterranean threats and the vulnerable flesh of those who, to the very end, chose not to be silent. The day of December 25th, 1951, began for the Moores as a modest Christmas day, framed by the same pines that had sheltered them for years. The weather was mild, the light clear. A simple meal was prepared, a few decorations adjusted, thoughts tuned to the double significance of the date, the Christian holiday and their 25th wedding anniversary. A quarter-century spent side by side, teaching, raising their daughter, filling out forms, organizing meetings, holding firm. In their wooden house, this duration was embodied by accumulated objects, books, papers, photographs, habits. Nothing in these gestures hinted at what lay beneath the floor of the marital bedroom. The device installed there, in the darkness, was silent. It bore no particular odor, no outward sign for one traversing the room in socks. It waited. Those who placed it had chosen the location with care, beneath the bed, beneath the heat of their shared life. They had chosen the moment with the same precision. Christmas night, when the house was full not only of bodies, but also of symbols. The evening when both peace and fidelity were celebrated. Hours passed. The day slowly declined, as always in winter. The sun vanished behind the pines, yielding to a soft darkness, pieced by the lights of houses and churches. Communities sang, paid, gathied. At the Moo home, the celebration was undoubtedly quiet, in thy likeness. Preparations had been made to mark the wedding anniversary, even with scant means. Perhaps a few gifts, exchanged wads, a shade meal. The house exhaled a fragile normalcy. On the table, plates, glasses. In a cone, papes hanged a little more carefully than usual, out of prudence. Witnesses would recall that evening from the moment everything factued. It was a little past 10 o'clock, according to epotes. Neighbors spoke of a dull, violent, unusual sound. Not a gunshot, not a thunderstorm, but something deep, emanating from the earth. An explosion. In the relative darkness of the lane, beneath the pines, a house had just lifted, lightly, factued from within. Windows shattered, planks disintegrated. The metal bedroom Hay and Harriette had lain down was gutted. Descriptions of the scene, in police epots and subsequent accounts, largely remained confined to administrative language. One eed, significant structural damage, wooden debris, shattered windows, blown out flue. The wads avoided, as much as possible, flesh. They spoke of architecture, materials. But behind these terms lay bodies, those of Hay and Harriette, thrown, bruised, tapped by planks, nails, glass. Thy bed, became in an instant an indistinct mass from which one had to distinguish, dislodge, recognize. The fist to ave on the scene we not law enforcement, but neighbors. They emerged from thy homes, alerted by the din, by the vague vibration of the earth beneath thy feet. Some dressed hastily, authors and as they we. They saw the moo house gutted, part of the roof collapsed, sections of walls open to the night. Thee was dust, splints of wood, schemes, flashlights, improvised lanterns, caved out ease of light in the chaos. Hay's silhouette was discernible, gravely injured. Harriette's wounded, bloody, yet intermittently conscious, according to some testimonies. The scene, at that moment, was not abstract. These were no longer forms, reports, petitions. These were bodies, neighbors whom one knew, whom one had encountered at church, at school, at the store. They were carried, carefully lifted, placed as best as possible on improvised stretchers, torn off doors, blankets. There was no talk yet of political crime. There was only talk of injured people to evacuate, of shot breaths, of blood, of pain. In the Mims night, the activist and his wife became, for a few moments, simply Hay and Harriette, two human beings broken by an act whose full implications were not yet understood. Medical services arrived, alerted as best they could be. The ambulance, the vehicles that presented themselves that night, officially transported victims of a domestic explosion. In the initial exchanges, an accident, a gas leak, a hypothetical technical cause were evoked. It was more convenient, immediately, not to utter the word bomb. Yet those who lived there, those who knew the context, had little doubt. An explosion occurring precisely beneath the bedroom in the home of a known civil rights activist on Christmas night did not resemble a coincidence. The journey to the hospital was documented in medical records. One found there the admission time, the description of injuries, the emergency procedures. The language was clinical, almost detached. Head trauma, internal injuries, critical condition. It was in these same records that Hay Moore's name was followed by a definitive note. Deceased. According to versions, he died en route or shortly after his arrival. For the medical institution, it was a severe case among others, recorded on a line with a date and time. For the community, it was an irreparable loss, announced in whispers, muffled sobs, suppressed tears. Harriette, for her part, was kept alive. She was transported, treated as much as the means of the time and the segregated setting allowed. Her injuries were severe. Her body bore the trace of the explosion, the collapse, the shock. In the days that followed, her name remained in patient registers, surrounded by figures, temperatures, daily notes. The white world, for now, saw in her only a seriously wounded person. Those who loved her knew she was more than that. Hay's companion of 25 years of struggle and life, the woman who shared his choices, his fears, his hopes. Around the hospital, in the corridors, in the separated waiting rooms, Segregation continued to trace its lines. Moore's relatives could not move as they pleased, did not have access to all information, depended on the goodwill of doctors, nurses, administrators. The structural injustice, the very thing the couple fought, now governed the treatment of their own bodies. It was a tragic irony that would be written nowhere, but that profoundly marked those who witnessed it. Meanwhile, in Mims, the gutted house had ceased to be merely a destroyed home. It became a scene. The police arrived. Authorities examined the debris, the remains of the floor, the fragments the explosion had projected all around. Notes were taken, plans sketched, photographs shot. Talk began of explosive, of a device placed under the bedroom. The idea of an accident receded. That of an attack imposed itself. But words remained cautious in the initial reports. There was no talk yet of the Klan, no talk yet of terrorism. They spoke of an unknown cause, of an ongoing investigation. Newspapers, the very next day, began relaying the news. The black press, informed by activist networks, quickly spoke of a bombing, an attack against a local NAACP leader. The local white press, for its part, adopted a more reserved tone. The explosion was mentioned, Hayes' death and Harriette's injuries were reported, and emphasis was placed on the sadness of this event occurring on Christmas Eve. The moral angle was one of tragedy, of fatality, more than one of responsibility. The question of who and why was deferred. In the black community, these questions could not be deferred. Everyone immediately linked the bomb to Hayes' activism. Too many threats, too many rumors, too many precedents elsewhere for it to be seen as anything else. Conversations, in churches, in homes, on porches, oscillated between anger and fear. Anger against those who dared to strike a man and a woman in their bed on Christmas night. Fear of what this act signified. If this could be done to the Moores, who would be safe? For the authorities, the night of December 25th opened another series of files, police reports, interrogation transcripts, correspondence with the government, FBI interventions. The crime, now, had to be presented as an object of investigation with potential suspects, leads, hypotheses. In these papers, the couple tended to be reduced to two names, two victims. They were spoken of in the third person, described by their age, profession, their role in the community. The years of work that led to this moment were no longer seen, or pretended not to be seen. Yet, in the gutted house, beneath the debris, amidst the splinters of wood, some documents survived. Letters, lists, notes escaped destruction. They would be recovered, sometimes by relatives, sometimes by investigators, and would, later, nourish the memory of that night. Between the ripped planks and displaced stones, the ink still held, obstinately. It testified, silently, to what Hay and Harriette were doing there, beneath those pines, before the bomb came to interrupt their lives. Thus, the night of December 25, 1951, crystallized both as a moment of shattering and as a turning point. Shattering for those who heard the ground tremble, who saw the house tear apart, who carried the bodies. A turning point for a state that could hardly continue to pretend that segregation was merely a tradition and not a system maintained, if necessary, by the most brutal violence. In the hours that followed, official Florida strove to reclaim the language of control. Open a file, announce an investigation, promise enlightenment. But for those who, beneath the Mims pines, saw the Moore home explode, the light that night took the blinding form of a conflagration that revealed, without artifact, the exact nature of the danger they had denounced for so long. The day after the explosion, the Moore house ceased to be merely a destroyed home. It became, in the language of authorities, a scene. The words changed. Where neighbors, the previous night, spoke of injured bodies, screams, torn planks, now there was talk of a zone to secure, a perimeter to establish. Ribbons, improvised barriers, uniformed men organized the space. Lines were drawn that the curious were not to cross. The same wooden planks that had sheltered the lives of Hay and Harriette were now evidence. The initial reports from local police described the state of the premises with selective precision. The location of the bedroom, the impact zone, the structural damage were mentioned. Fragments, splinters, pieces of metal were collected, placed in bags, numbered. There was a visible concern to show action, to do what was necessary. But, from the first hours, a tension emerged between the stated will to resolve the case and the implicit limits set. In these documents, the word bomb took time to assert itself. There was talk of an explosion of unknown origin, as if language itself hesitated to acknowledge the nature of the crime. Very quickly, the case transcended county boundaries. The death of a local NAACP leader, the attack committed on Christmas night, attracted the attention of the national press and civil rights organizations. Telegrams were sent to Florida's governor, the Department of Justice, the FBI. Newspaper clippings that survived showed, in the following days, a proliferation of headlines associating Moore's name with words like bombing, terror, racial violence. Florida's image, a state of vacations and citrus, was suddenly pierced by this vision of a blackened house beneath the pines. Under this pressure, the governor announced that a full investigation would be conducted. Communiques were drafted, carefully weighed. They contained codified phrases: "The state will tolerate no act of violence. All efforts will be made to bring the perpetrators to justice." These declarations were sent to newspapers, cited in radio bulletins. They aimed to reassure, to project an image of control, but they said nothing of the gap, already perceivable, between the solemn tone of the promises and the manner in which local forces genuinely envisioned the search for those responsible. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's entry into the affair was presented, in newspaper columns, as a sign of seriousness. Federal agents arrived, interrogated, examined the scene, compared recovered fragments with those from other attacks. They typed out reports, paginated them, filed them in folders marked Moore bombing case. These documents, later found in the archives, attested to real work. Leads were discussed, suspects considered, hypotheses debated. Names of Ku Klux Klan members circulated. Links were established between clandestine meetings, hate speech, and the bomb placed under the bedroom. In parallel, Florida authorities conducted their own investigations. The Florida Bureau of Investigation, or its equivalent at the time, opened a file. Agents interviewed Mims, residents, neighbors, shopkeepers, police officers. They noted rumors, impressions, remarks made in bars, in squares, outside white churches. More than once, the Ku Klux Klan's name was whispered, followed by heavy silences. But these names, these allusions, once transcribed, lost their force. From testimony to report, from report to summary, living speech transformed into cautious phrases. It has been suggested that some believe that unconfirmed rumors. The fragmentation of the investigations also appeared in how institutions deflected responsibility. Local authorities pointed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, emphasizing federal jurisdiction when civil rights might be at stake. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, for its part, depended heavily on information provided by these same local authorities and on the cooperation of witnesses living under their jurisdiction. Between the two, letters, reports, summaries circulated. Each service produced its own file, its own partial narrative. The Moore case multiplied, diversified. Here, an expert report on explosive remnants. There, notes on the racial situation in the county. Elsewhere, summaries for superiors, where formulations grew vague as one ascended the hierarchy. In this mass of paper, one motif recurred: the difficulty of obtaining direct testimonies explicitly implicating Ku Klux Klan members. Fear, here, became a silent actor. Black residents of Mims knew what the Ku Klux Klan could do to those who spoke. They also knew that some uniformed men, some magistrates, some local notables had, in the evening, attended meetings where oaths were sworn over a burning cross. Even when clues converged on a specific group of men, the boundary between what is known and what can be proven remained thick. Federal Bureau of Investigation reports mentioned probable suspects, known Ku Klux Klan members, but these designations struggled to transform into concrete indictments. As weeks passed, a double discourse took hold. To the national press and black organizations, political leaders reiterated that the investigation was ongoing, that all leads were being followed, that justice would ultimately triumph. On the ground, in Florida, time elapsed. Interrogations were conducted, then subjects released. Inconsistencies were noted, but not pursued to their conclusion. In certain offices, it was known which men ordinarily planted bombs, who had access to explosives, who had uttered explicit threats. But it was also known what ties these men maintained with local power, what secrets they shared, what tacit protections they enjoyed. For the Moore family, for their daughter, for their loved ones, this phase of investigation was an additional ordeal. First, the hope that those responsible would be identified, judged, condemned. Then, the slow realization that the judicial machinery, so prolific in files and reports, seemed incapable of achieving a conclusion. Updates were promised, new leads announced, the press convened to repeat the same phrase: the investigation is still open. Subsequent years would demonstrate that this openness was primarily an administrative state, a file never officially closed, but allowed, in practice, to sediment in the archives. The press played an ambivalent role in this process. The national black press and certain progressive newspapers continued to follow the case, publishing in-depth articles, periodically recalling the Christmas night, Hayes' work, Harriet's courage. They evoked the lack of arrests, the delays, the contradictions. Conversely, many local white newspapers gradually reduced the affair to an old news item. After the initial, more abundant articles, mentions grew scarce, confined to inner pages, sometimes occasioned by an official statement, an anniversary, or an NAACP request. White public memory thus made way for other subjects, other urgencies. For Florida's black community, the impunity that settled in was not merely a disappointment, it was a confirmation. It confirmed that the judicial system, as it operated, did not truly protect them, that the law, so verbose when it came to punishing crimes committed by black people, suddenly became hesitant, blind, when it involved prosecuting white people implicated in racial violence. The Moore house, destroyed by the bomb, found its symbolic equivalent in these investigation files. Shaken structures, scattered fragments, a whole that failed to cohere. In the offices of the FBI and the state of Florida, other concerns gradually took precedence. The Cold War, anti-communist preoccupations, economic stakes, election campaigns. The Moore case became one note among others in the long list of unsolved racial cases in the South. It was still spoken of, at times, when new elements emerged, when an informant came forward, when a change of government or FBI leadership briefly reopened the box. But these reinitiations, for the most part, did not lead to a trial. Impunity, ultimately, also etched itself onto paper, not as an explicit confession nowhere existed, a document stating, "We chose not to prosecute." It was inscribed instead in the margins, in the cautious phrases punctuating provisional closing reports. Insufficient evidence, inconclusive lead, no indictment recommended at this stage. These phrases, repeated, ultimately produced a concrete effect: the absence of culprits before a court. The ink that could have inscribed names under the accused heading remained in the pen. Thus, the investigations following the night of December 25, 1951, left behind a trail of files, notes, photos, sketches, but no verdict. They revealed a state that, under pressure, managed to mobilize its institutions, but failed or refused to see through what justice would have demanded. For the living, for those who continue to pass by the ground where the Moore house once stood, this absence of judgment takes the form of a heavy void, even harder to bear than the initial shattering of the explosion. The noise of the crime was followed by the continuous murmur of an endless procedure, until, gradually, that murmur merged into silence, an official, cold silence which still covers, beneath the pines, the trace of those who were killed and those whose names were refused to be uttered. In the years following the attack, the official files of the Moore case began to gather dust. Occasionally, a sheet was added, a new testimony, an internal note, a stapled newspaper clipping. Then, with increasing rarity, in the offices of the state of Florida, in those of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the folders marked with the Moore name occupied an even more silent place on the shelves. Administratively, the investigation remained open. Politically, it was already delegated. The 1950 concluded, then the 1960 began, planting other crosses on the map of racial violence. Other names asserted themselves in the public sphere: Medgar Evers, the four girls of the Birmingham Church, and late Martin Luther King. Bombs, assassinations, lynchings proliferated. Horror almost became a chronicle. In this tumult, the Christmas night of 1951 in Mims, Florida, became one of those tragic events sometimes cited as a precedent, a kind of dark preface to the following decade, without always lingering upon it. Yet, for some, the Moore case never truly closed. In the region's black community, in families, in churches, Harry and Harriette continued to be evoked. Stories were told of how the bomb destroyed their home, how Harry died that same night, how Harriette struggled for 9 days before succumbing herself. Their work, their forms, their meetings were remembered. This memory remained largely oral, passed down from generation to generation through conversations, vigils, and sermons. It lacked the force of official archives, but it persisted. In the 1970s and 1980s, a few historians, journalists, and activists began to take a close look at the case. They delved into archives, requested access to files, perused Federal Bureau of Investigation reports, Florida police notes, and newspaper clippings. They discovered a fragmented, sometimes contradictory, but sufficiently dense documentary landscape to understand that, on several occasions, there had been near misses in naming those responsible. Names appeared in these documents: known Ku Klux Klan members, already suspected of other attacks, mentioned in internal notes as probably involved. These researchers, armed not merely with anger but with historical analysis tools, patiently reconstructed the investigation's chronology. They showed how, as early as the 1950s, certain men had been identified as serious suspects, how informants had provided precise information, how leads had been abandoned without true justification. They interviewed survivors, the children of those who knew the Moores, former police officers, retired agents. Each contributed a fragment, a phrase overheard in passing, a memory of interrogation, an impression of the era. Little by little, this accumulation of efforts eventually produced a political effect. Moral pressure, stemming both from the black community and the work of historians, led the state of Florida to announce, several decades after the facts, that it would reopen the Moore file. Talk then emerged of an unresolved case and a cold case. The folders, believed to be static, were taken from the archives, placed on desks. New investigators from another generation perused them. They found traces of their predecessors, interrogations, suspect lists, technical reports. In these new investigations, conducted at the end of the 20th century, the state and, at times, Federal authorities attempted to pick up the thread. What could still be verified was checked. Locations, written testimonies, identities of men whose names appeared in reports. Archival information was cross-referenced with late findings from researchers and witnesses finally willing to speak. Confidences uttered decades after the facts were heard. An old man recounting an admission once whispered in a bar. A former Klan member who, before dying, described how the operation was planned. A white neighbor who articulated what he had always suspected but never said. These new inquiries, however, collided with an implacable reality: time. Many of the suspects identified at the time had died. Others were too old or too ill for lengthy interrogations. Physical evidence had vanished. Locations had changed. Local archives had been poorly preserved. Late accounts, even if sincere, clashed with the demands of criminal procedure. Justice required solid, recent, cross-referenced evidence for judgment. Most investigators knew they would likely never secure a trial, but they pursued, nonetheless, another objective: to establish sufficient historical truth to, at the very least, officially name those who appeared to have been responsible. At the conclusion of these re-examinations, the state of Florida published a report. In this document, drafted in both legal and administrative language, investigators acknowledged that available evidence converged on a small group of Ku Klux Klan members. Names were provided for the first time with this relative certainty in an official document. Emphasis was placed on the fact that the individuals in question were now deceased and that no prosecution was possible. But the gesture was, symbolically, important. Where the initial investigations had stopped at the door of these suspects, the new ones clearly designated them, even if it was too late for a courtroom. This report, and the accompanying historical works, were not a substitute for justice. They replaced neither a trial nor a conviction. They could not repair what the 1951 bomb destroyed, nor what decades of impunity inflicted upon the family and community. But they altered the archive. They added, alongside the cautious phrases of the 1950s, new lines where one finally read that the attack against Harry and Harriette Moore must be understood as a targeted assassination, directly linked to their civil rights activism and the Klan's activity in Florida. For the Moore descendants, for the black inhabitants of Mims and its environs, these belated conclusions stirred mixed feelings. There was a form of relief in seeing names finally uttered, in reading in black and white, in official documents, what the community had long known. There was also renewed pain, to discover that action might perhaps have been taken sooner, that clear leads had been neglected, that political choices had influenced the decision to prosecute or not. The recognition of historical truth illuminated the accumulated failures. In the academic world, the Moore case became emblematic. It was seen as the first major assassination of a civil rights activist in the modern period, preceding the better-known wave of the 1960s. Articles, books, and conferences revisited this bombed Christmas to show that racist political violence had not waited for marches on Washington to unleash its fury. Researchers emphasized the role of teachers, the centrality of schools, forms, and pay stubs, this link between paper and blood that traversed the entire Moore story. In archival repositories, the files dedicated to the case now occupied a different place. The folders marked Moore were no longer merely remnants of an unfinished investigation. They had also become sources for understanding how institutions reacted or failed to react to a political crime. The margins, handwritten notes, collections, annotations in red or blue, took on new meaning. They testified to hesitations, enunciations, blind spots. The archive was no longer solely the neutral account of what transpired. It was also a mirror of the fears and complicities of the era. In this slow process of reopening, another dynamic unfolded: the meeting between living memory and written memory. Descendants, activists, Visitors came to consult these files, read these reports, confront what they discovered with the narrative transmitted within their families or communities. Though this confrontation, a collective grieving process, long hindered, could begin. Grieving consisted not only of mourning the dead, but also of naming what killed them, of understanding why those meant to protect them failed. Thus, the quest for truth surrounding the Moore case did not resemble a classic police investigation culminating in a trial and judgment. It resembled more a long journey through layers of paper, testimonies, and silences. Files, closed too soon, were reopened belatedly. They still contained grey areas, unanswered questions, but they now bore the mark of an effort, that of not letting the Christmas 1951 bomb be swallowed by administrative oblivion, that of publicly recognizing that, behind the apparent inability to solve the case, there were also choices, enunciations, complicities. At the end of this path, truth remains imperfect, riddled with holes. The culprits were not judged. The Moores did not hear the confession of those who placed the bomb beneath their bed, but the archive, for its part, changed its face. It no longer merely documented the explosion. It also showed the slow, very slow, awakening of a state compelled, decades late, to confront what it had refused to see, that, on Christmas night 1951, it was not merely two people whom they attempted to kill, but the very idea that black citizens could claim, through the pen and the ballot, a full and complete place in American democracy. Today, upon arriving in Mims, Florida, it is no longer the same wooden house that stands beneath the pines. The original structure vanished in the explosion, then in the years that followed. In its place, one finds a space conceived for memory, a small commemorative complex, a museum, a reconstruction. The materials have changed, more concrete, brick, glass, but something of the atmosphere lingers. The ground is the same, the light filtering through the trees is the same, the wind passing through the branches resembles that of December 1951. At the entrance, panels explain who Harry and Harriette Moore were. For those who have never heard their names, a few lines summarize the most visible aspects of their lives. Teachers, civil rights activists, organizers of voter registration campaigns, victims of a Christmas Eve bombing. One sees their enlarged photographs, their serious faces, their simple clothes, alongside dates, places, figures. Official memory now expresses itself in the language of exhibitions, explanatory texts, display cases, selected objects. Inside the museum, documents once hidden or scattered are exhibited. One can see reproductions of vote registration forms, copies of pay stubs, letters written by Hay, photographs of classrooms where Harriette is discernible amidst the students. Behind the glass, these papers hold a different status. They are no longer weapons in an ongoing struggle, no pieces of a judicial file. They have become witnesses. The ink has taken on a slightly faded hue. The words, however, remain clear. Equal pay, discrimination, lynching, vote. The visitor follows a path that recounts segregation in Florida, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the Moores' commitment, the night of the attack, the investigations, the belated openings. Newspaper excerpts are displayed. On one side, clippings from the black press denouncing the Moore bombing as a racist crime. On the other, more cautious or detached editorials from the white press. One reads promises of justice, declarations from governors, summaries of investigation reports. The archive, which had long resided in boxes, now presents itself as a continuous, ordered history. In one room, a guest book remains open on a table. Visitors leave a few words. Some come from Florida, others from farther afield. Descendants of the local black community, students on school trips, tourists drawn by the mention of a civil rights museum. The phrases are simple. Thank you. We will not forget. Your fight continues. I did not know your story. Sometimes a visitor leaves a discreet confession. I was born here and was never told about this. I am white and am ashamed to only discover this today. The trembling script, the still fresh ink, in their own way, extend the ancient dialogue between paper and voice. Outside, a stele or a stone wall bears the names of Hay and Harriette, their birth and death dates, sometimes a quotation. The stone, here, plays the role that the law never fulfilled. It officially fixes their place in history. Where courts pronounced no convictions, elected officials, state representatives came, years late, to deliver speeches of recognition, regret, sometimes apology. Ribbons were cut, plaques unveiled, ceremonies organized. The voice of authority, long silent or cautious, finally manifested itself in this late register of commemoration. Yet, even in this gesture, a discrepancy persists. Official memory arrives in hindsight. It comes to adorn with public dignity what, for decades, was experienced as raw violence, without reparation. The words carved in stone, courage, justice, sacrifice, are true, but they always risk transforming victims into almost abstract, sanitized figures. For this memory to be honest, one must also remember the concrete details, the wooden house, the forms on the table, the weariness on their faces, the fear, the hesitations, the decision to continue regardless. In schools, sometimes, a lesson, a unit, is now devoted to the Moore's story. Students read excerpts from documents, look at photographs, listen to recordings of witnesses or documentaries. They are told that this attack is considered the first major assassination of a civil rights activist in the modern period. Even before the names that became most famous, they discover that the struggle for the right to vote, for equality before the law, unfolded not only in large cities and massive marches, but also in small houses hidden beneath the pines, through forms, ballots, and meetings of a few people. Meanwhile, outside, the contemporary world continues to produce its own files, its own contradictions. Debates on police violence, on hate crimes, on vote suppression, on how racial history is taught or minimized in schools, persist. In newspapers, other names appear, associated with more recent racist violence. In some regions, discussions continue about how far to go in recognizing past crimes. Arguments arise over monuments, textbooks, curriculum. In the face of this, the museum and memorial dedicated to the Moors are neither a timeless sanctuary nor a mere tourist stop. They are a place where one can measure, physically, the distance between words and deeds. One need only enter, observe the letters sent in 1951, the promises of justice written that year, then recall that no trial followed, to understand that history cannot be reduced to a linear progression towards greater enlightenment. It is made of uptakes, enunciations, silences, and belated resumptions. In the room dedicated to the night of December 25, 1951, a space is often left for contemplation. Few objects, a few phrases, perhaps a bench. Visitors are invited to sit, to imagine that house, that bed, that muffled sound in the night. It is recalled that Harry died that same night, that Harriette died 9 days later, that their assassins were never judged. This is not an appeal to spectacular indignation, but to a profound awareness. The horror is not dramatized with effects. It is exposed with restraint, so that each person can, in their own way, gauge its weight. At night, when the museum closes, the site becomes silent once more. The panels darken, the exhibits recede behind the glass. Visitors' words slumber in the guest book. The pines, for their part, continue to stand as they did in 1951. The difference, now, is that what happened here has a name, a narrative, an inscription in public memory. The silence that falls is no longer precisely the same as that of old. It is no longer solely an imposed silence, that of fear and concealment. It can become, for those who come to reflect, a chosen, attentive silence, where one listens to what the archive does not directly speak. At the end of this journey, a question remains that cannot be easily closed. What is the value of a belated memory in the face of a justice that never arrived? To speak the truth, to name those responsible, to tell the story, to build a museum, to erect a stela, all this is necessary. But it replaces neither the interrupted lives, nor the years of fear, nor the feeling, passed down to subsequent generations, that the institutions claiming to uphold the law can, at times, let their own die in silence. And yet, this imperfect memory is what we have. It is made of preserved papers, signatures, photographs, testimonies, engraved stones. It depends on the will to continue opening files, to teach the names, to recount the nights when bombs were placed under beds because teachers had helped black citizens fill out a voting form. It also depends on the ability to view our present in the light of that past, to recognize, in today's mechanisms of injustice, something of the systems the Moors confronted. Leaving the site, one leaves behind the reconstructed house, the museum, the pines. One carries away, if one consents, a fragment of this history. A face, a date, a letter, a phrase. This fragment does not call for a triumphant conclusion. Rather, it calls for vigilance, an attention to the paper one signs, to the laws one votes for, to the voices one does not hear. The night that, on a December 25th, engulfed Harry and Harriette Moore, continues, in a certain way, to cast its shadow. The question that remains, silent, is this: what shall we do, today, with the light they tried to kindle, patiently, with forms, ink, and the courage to write their names in a country that, for too long, refused to read it?